The first time Nolan Voss called my son family, Levi was already holding the one document that could ruin him. Nolan thought he was walking into a redemption story. What he actually walked into was 19 years of receipts, silence, and a boy he had never bothered to know. By the time he realized which one it was, the room was already turning against him. My name is Cadence Hodges, and the night my marriage ended, I was too tired to fight for it. I was exactly 8 months pregnant, carrying the heavy, low ache of a child ready to meet the world, standing in the center of our narrow townhouse kitchen in Charlotte. The rain was tapping a relentless, steady rhythm against the single window over the sink. I remember the exact moment the front door unlocked because I had been staring at the microwave clock. It blinked 11:14 in neon green. The numbers felt like a countdown I did not understand yet. My ankles were swollen to the point where my shoes had become a distant memory. I shifted my weight, leaning my hip against the cheap laminate counter, waiting for the familiar sound of my husband dropping his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. But there was no clatter of metal. There was only the soft, deliberate click of the deadbolt sliding into place. Nolan Voss walked into the kitchen. He was not carrying the groceries I had asked him to pick up on his way home from the office. He was not carrying the kind of weary affection a man usually brings to his heavily pregnant wife at the end of a long Tuesday. He was unnaturally calm. His suit, a sharp charcoal wool, was perfectly pressed, completely unbothered by the damp Carolina weather outside. In his right hand, he held a slim, dark leather folder. "You are home late," I said, my voice thick with exhaustion. Nolan did not take off his coat. He did not step forward to kiss my cheek or place a hand on my swollen stomach. He stopped on the opposite side of the small, square dining table. He placed the leather folder flat on the surface and rested his hands on either side of it. "Sit down, Cadence," he said. I did not sit. The effort of lowering myself into one of those hard wooden chairs and pulling myself back up felt like too much work. "What is it?" I asked, suddenly acutely aware of the buzzing overhead bulb. It was a cheap fluorescent tube that had been humming for 3 months, a sound we had both learned to ignore. Now, it seemed deafening. Nolan took a breath that was measured, practiced. "I have been offered a position," he began, his voice smooth, devoid of any nervous energy that should accompany a major life change. "A senior role at Harbor Meridian Capital." "Harbor Meridian," I repeated, the name tasting foreign in my mouth. It was a firm in another city, a place of glass towers and ruthless acquisitions, a place Nolan had idolized since his first year of business school. "That is huge. But they are in Atlanta." "They are," he agreed, his eyes locking onto mine with a chilling emptiness. "It is the opportunity I have been building toward for 5 years. It is the kind of leverage that changes everything. But it requires absolute focus, 70-hour weeks, constant travel, unrestricted mobility." He paused, letting the silence stretch between us. The smell of the cold tomato soup I had abandoned on the stove suddenly hit the back of my throat, metallic and sour. "A baby right now," Nolan continued, his tone not faltering, "would ruin the version of my life I'm trying to build. A family, a wife anchored to a townhouse in Charlotte, a newborn screaming through the night. I cannot do it. Cadence, I will not do it." The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. I waited for the punchline. I waited for the crack in his composure, the panicked confession of a man who was simply terrified of impending fatherhood. But Nolan did not look like a guilty man. He looked like a consultant presenting strategic options to a failing subsidiary. "You are leaving," I whispered. It was not a question. "I am restructuring," he corrected, and the sheer corporate cruelty of the word made my breath hitch. He flipped open the leather folder. Inside was a neat stack of papers, crisp and white, securely stapled. He slid the packet across the polished wood of the table. The movement was so fluid, so rehearsed, as if our marriage were just another underperforming account he needed to close out before the end of the fiscal quarter. "These are separation papers," he explained smoothly. "I have already signed them. They are generous. Considering our current liquid assets, if you sign them tonight, we can avoid a drawn-out legal process. It is the most efficient path forward for both of us." I stared down at the documents. My name was typed at the top, formal and black. I felt a kick against my ribs, a sharp reminder of the life growing inside me, the life Nolan was casually writing out of his 5-year plan. My world narrowed with a terrifying suddenness. I could no longer hear the rain. I only heard the buzzing bulb. I only smelled the ruined soup. I only saw the silver cuffs of his tailored shirt, the sharp glint of his cufflinks catching the harsh overhead light as he pushed a silver pen toward me. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the packet closer. I was operating purely on shock, my brain moving through molasses while my body flooded with adrenaline. I flipped past the first page, then the second. The legal jargon blurred together, a wall of dense text detailing property division and waiver of alimony. But as I turned to the fourth page, I noticed something odd. There was one extra page clipped into the back of the packet. It was not printed on the same weight of paper, and the formatting was slightly different. It looked like a dense legal attachment, full of boilerplate language regarding liabilities and indemnifications. "What is this?" I asked, my finger hovering over the unfamiliar page. Nolan barely glanced at it. He adjusted his watch, a nervous tick disguised as a casual gesture. "It is just standard financial cleanup," he said dismissively. "Closing out some old shared credit lines, separating our joint liabilities so nothing interferes with my background check for Harbor Meridian. It is standard boilerplate. Just sign everything at the bottom. Cadence. We do not need to make this harder than it already is." Standard financial cleanup. The phrase felt wrong, slippery, but I was standing in a freezing kitchen with a backache that felt like a knife twisting in my spine. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my jaw. I was looking at a man I had slept next to for 4 years, realizing I did not know him at all. The sheer physical exhaustion of being 8 months pregnant collided with the emotional trauma of his betrayal, leaving me entirely hollowed out. I did not have the strength to wage a war at 11:20 at night. I did not have the energy to parse through legal traps or scream until my throat bled. I just wanted him out of my kitchen. I wanted the cold, dead energy of his presence gone from my home. I picked up the heavy silver pen. I signed my name on the lines he pointed to, but as he looked away to check his phone, my fingers found the edge of the attachment page. In a split second of clarity driven by pure instinct, I slid my nail under the staple, loosening it just enough to separate the carbon copy underneath the final signature line. I slipped the thin yellow paper into the deep pocket of my maternity cardigan while pretending to adjust my waistband. I did not tell him. I did not even know why I did it, only that a quiet voice in my head demanded I keep something of my own. Nolan gathered the papers with practiced efficiency, slipping them back into his leather folder and snapping it shut. He looked satisfied. The transaction was complete. He turned toward the door, but stopped with his hand on the knob. He looked back at me, standing heavy and alone by the stove. "You should not look at me like a monster. Cadence," he said, his voice dropping to a low, reasonable register that was somehow crueler than shouting. "I am just being honest. I refuse to be trapped in a small, struggling life. You will be fine. You always make do." He made it clear, in that one precise sentence, that he saw me and the unborn baby not as a family to love, but as dead weight he was finally cutting loose. The door opened, letting in a gust of wet wind, and then it closed. The deadbolt clicked again. 2 weeks later, the dull ache in my back turned into a sharp, blinding reality. I drove myself to the hospital at 2 a.m, gripping the steering wheel through every contraction. I went into labor alone in a sterile room filled with the beeping of monitors. There was no one to hold my hand, no one to wipe my forehead, no one to share the terrifying, miraculous weight of the moment. After 14 hours of agony, I gave birth to a son. He had dark hair and fiercely observant eyes that seemed too ancient for a newborn. When the tired nurse handed me the clipboard with the birth certificate paperwork, she offered a sympathetic smile. "Father's information," she asked softly. tapping her pen against the blank section. I looked down at the tiny, sleeping boy wrapped in a striped hospital blanket. I felt a fierce, terrifying surge of protection. I picked up the pen and wrote my name. Then, in the section for the baby's name, I wrote Levi Hodges. I left Nolan's name completely off the birth certificate. I left the lines blank. It was not an act of spite. It was not a petty revenge from a scorned woman. It was simply the first absolute truth of Levi's life. Nolan Voss had surrendered his claim in a kitchen while the rain fell. He had traded his blood for a leather folder and a corner office. He had not earned the space on this paper, and I was never going to give him something he did not earn. I packed whatever I owned into the back of a borrowed van and left the manicured suburbs behind forever. My new reality was a cramped second-floor apartment situated directly over a 24-hour laundromat on the far east side of the city. The entire building hummed with the constant, vibrating mechanical rhythm of commercial washing machines. The air always smelled heavily of industrial bleach, cheap lavender fabric softener, and warm dryer lint. If I dropped a baby bottle in the kitchen, it would roll all the way into the tiny living room because the cheap linoleum floor slanted at a severe, undeniable angle. During the bitter winter months, the radiators banged relentlessly, and the ancient plumbing complained with loud, metallic groans that echoed through the thin walls. I learned to sleep through the noise, mostly because true sleep had become a luxury I could no longer afford. Survival quickly settled into a brutal, unforgiving rhythm. I found a daytime job doing medical billing for a chaotic walk-in clinic downtown. From 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening, I sat under flickering overhead lights, arguing with insurance adjusters over denied claims and coding errors. I learned exactly how ruthless systems could be to people who did not understand the rules. After I clocked out, I picked Levi up from a subsidized neighborhood daycare, fed him whatever I could manage, and logged onto my second-hand laptop. From 7 o'clock until midnight, I worked a remote shift booking reservations for a national hotel chain. I learned to function almost entirely on black diner coffee, endless color-coded spreadsheets, and roughly 4 hours of broken rest a night. Every single dollar I managed to scrape together went straight into a thick, black ledger notebook. I wrote everything down by hand. There was absolutely no room for error, no financial buffer for even the smallest mistake. I tracked the cost of baby formula, the $450 for rent, the gallons of gas needed to keep my dying car running, the mandatory rounds of antibiotics for Levi when he caught daycare colds, and eventually, the cost of sturdy school shoes. It was the deeply humiliating arithmetic of a life lived constantly on the edge of total ruin. I sat at the slanted kitchen table every Sunday night, moving pennies around to cover utility late fees when the hotel shifts did not pay out in time. The true, devastating cost of my marriage did not hit me until Levi was exactly 6 months old. I was washing plastic bottles in the sink when my cell phone rang. A debt collector with a flat, aggressive voice informed me that I was personally liable for a defaulted commercial credit line. He quoted a number that made the blood rush out of my head, demanding immediate payment on a balance of $48,000. I gripped the edge of the counter and told him he had the wrong person. I told him I had never owned a business, let alone a commercial credit account. He simply read my social security number back to me and coldly cited a personal guarantee signed the previous year. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking so violently I dropped a bottle onto the floor. I tore through the bottom of my bedroom closet until I found the thin, yellow carbon copy I had instinctively kept on my last night as a married woman. I spread it flat on the counter under the harsh light. Without the immense pressure of a ticking clock, I finally read the dense, convoluted legal text. It was not a standard financial cleanup. That single piece of paper had legally bound me to one of my former husband's early high-risk commercial loans. He had deliberately used my clean credit profile as a shield, absorbing the capital to aggressively build his own portfolio while leaving me chained to the disastrous fallout. I could not prove the deception to a judge yet, but the cold mechanics of his betrayal were staring me right in the face. A different woman might have collapsed entirely under the sheer, suffocating unfairness of it all. I allowed myself exactly 10 minutes of silent crying on the bathroom floor. pressing my face into a damp towel so I would not wake my son. Then I washed my face, packed my bag, and made a firm decision. The very next morning, I drove to Queen City Technical College and enrolled in their continuing education program. I did not register for literature or history. I registered for forensic accounting, advanced contract law, and corporate fraud detection. If I was going to be buried by paperwork, I needed to learn exactly how to read the shovels that were digging the dirt. Levi did not have a normal, quiet childhood. He grew up in the back rows of drafty community college classrooms, sleeping soundly in his carrier while adjunct professors droned on about tax codes and liability loopholes. When he got a little older, he spent his evenings sitting quietly in the clinic's employee break room, drawing intricate shapes on the back of discarded patient billing sheets. Our slanted kitchen table was almost never used for warm family dinners. It was a permanent battlefield covered in neon yellow highlighters, long, curling streams of white calculator tape, and cheap plastic containers of cold macaroni. He learned to be perfectly still when I was tracing a financial discrepancy, watching my fingers fly across the adding machine keys with wide, observant eyes. It was during my second year of grueling night classes that I finally met Tessa Bloom. Tessa was a formidable former corporate auditor who had left the high-stress financial firms to become an adjunct instructor. She was incredibly sharp, entirely unsentimental, and possessed an eagle eye for structural inconsistencies in balance sheets. She noticed my obsessive, relentless precision during a complex mock audit assignment. She asked me to stay after class one rainy Tuesday evening, looked down at my heavily annotated workbook, and tapped her red pen against the desk. "You have a rare gift for finding the rot. Cadence," Tessa told me, her voice echoing slightly in the empty lecture hall. "Most people look at a page of numbers and see math. You look at it and see behavior. Never forget this one fundamental rule. People lie beautifully, but numbers rarely do." That single sentence became the absolute foundation of my entire survival strategy. I completely stopped throwing things away. I bought a heavy-duty cardboard banker's box from an office supply store and wrote "when I have time" in thick black permanent marker across the side. I placed it securely in the darkest corner of my bedroom closet. Every single bank statement, every aggressive collection notice, every piece of heavily redacted legal correspondence, and that crucial yellow carbon copy went straight inside. I meticulously collected every single scrap of evidence the man who abandoned us, assumed a tired, desperate single mother, would eventually lose or throw away in a panic. I was no longer just building a filing system. I was patiently, quietly building a trap. Children absorb the atmosphere of their homes long before they understand the mechanics of them. Levi did not just grow up. He calibrated himself to my exact frequency. By the time he was 7 years old, he was already a quiet, deeply analytical boy who seemed to process the world through a filter of silent observation. He noticed absolutely everything. Standing in the grocery store aisle, he would reach for the generic store brand of toasted oats instead of the brightly colored cereal box, fully aware that the 99-cent difference mattered. He knew exactly when I was forcing a smile to hide a migraine, or when I was artificially injecting energy into my voice after a grueling double shift. He also understood the unspoken hierarchy of the mail stacked on the kitchen counter. He knew the envelope with the red warning stripe meant the electricity took absolute priority, while the plain white envelopes could wait until the first of the next month. His sharp perception extended beyond our small domestic ecosystem and into the social dynamics of the playground. Kids are naturally inquisitive, and they possess a bluntness that can be breathtakingly cruel. Sitting on a park bench one humid Saturday afternoon, I watched a slightly older boy corner Levi near the swing set. The boy asked point blank where Levi's father was, noting that a man never came to pick him up from school or pushed him on the swings. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for my son to crumble or cry. Instead, Levi simply shrugged his narrow shoulders. He looked the other boy dead in the eye and said, "I have my mom." He walked away and went back to building a complex structure out of wood chips. I stayed on the bench, completely leveled. That single, simple sentence landed harder on my chest than any insult or physical blow ever could. It was a profound declaration of sufficiency, but it also highlighted the massive void he was casually navigating. From the very beginning, I made a conscious, deliberate choice never to poison my son with my own bitterness. It would have been incredibly easy to turn Nolan into a monster, to feed Levi a daily diet of resentment and anger, but I knew that carrying another person's hatred is a heavy burden for a child. When Levi asked questions, I answered them with age-appropriate honesty. I told him his father lived in another city and worked very hard. I refused to build Levi's foundational identity around the hollow silhouette of a man who chose to walk away. My son was going to be defined by who was present, not by who was absent. That philosophy was tested during a painful afternoon when Levi was in the 3rd grade. He came home with a standard-issue family tree assignment. It was a large piece of heavy green construction paper featuring the outline of a massive oak tree with dozens of blank leaves waiting to be filled. Most kids would blindly follow the template, writing down whatever names fit the designated maternal and paternal branches. I watched from the sink as Levi sat at the table with a black pen. He did not hesitate. He carefully traced over the lines of the trunk, and then he drew one single, sturdy branch reaching upward. He wrote my name on it in dark ink. He left the entire other half of the tree completely blank. I dried my hands on a towel, my throat tightening, and walked over to the table. I gently suggested that he could add his grandparents, or perhaps some aunts and uncles, just to fill out the leaves. Levi looked up at me, his dark eyes unblinking and entirely serious. "I would rather write what is real," he said softly. He did not need a fabricated forest. He was perfectly content with a single, deeply rooted tree. While Levi was learning the shape of our reality, my professional life took a sudden, monumental turn. Tessa Bloom, the adjunct professor who had recognized my knack for spotting financial anomalies, made a phone call on my behalf. That single recommendation secured me an entry-level interview at Blackthorne Compliance Partners. Blackthorne was a highly respected, deeply private advisory firm that specialized in investigating complex bookkeeping irregularities and high-level corporate misconduct. They were the people corporate boards called quietly when millions of dollars vanished without a trace. I walked into their sleek, glass-paneled offices wearing my only tailored suit, terrified but determined. They hired me at the absolute bottom of the ladder. I started doing receptionist-level administrative work, answering phones, binding thick reports, and logging incoming courier packages. I absorbed the language of the firm like a sponge. Whenever I finished my daily tasks early, I asked the senior analysts if I could review their discarded document batches. I started catching tiny, almost imperceptible formatting errors in their preliminary reports. Within 8 months, I was promoted to formal document review. By my 2nd year, I was moved on to active case support. Slowly and methodically, I transitioned into the highly specialized, shadowy world of tracing hidden money. I learned how executives used shell companies, offshore holding accounts, and layered corporate structures to bury assets. I learned that greed always leaves a paper trail if you know exactly which thread to pull. Levi became utterly fascinated with my work. He would sit at the kitchen table while I worked from home, watching the complex databases and cascading spreadsheets reflect on my monitor. He loved the geometric patterns of the data. He was especially captivated by a specific trick I had developed. He would watch me stare intently at a densely packed spreadsheet containing thousands of rows of financial data. I would hold my breath, let my eyes unfocus slightly to take in the entire grid, and within 20 seconds, I could drop my index finger onto the exact cell containing the fabricated number. "How do you do that?" he asked one evening, leaning over my shoulder. "Numbers have a rhythm," I explained, pointing to the screen. "When someone lies on a balance sheet, they disrupt the natural mathematical flow. It is like a song where one instrument is playing out of tune. You do not have to read every single note to know something is wrong. You just have to listen for the discord." Levi nodded slowly, his young mind already categorizing the information, locking it away for future use. He was learning to view the world through a lens of verifiable facts rather than assumed truths. By the time Levi was 10 years old, my salary at Blackthorn had finally stabilized enough to change our living situation. We moved out of the cramped apartment and rented a slightly better single-story house in a quiet neighborhood. It had a small, fenced backyard and pipes that did not scream in the middle of the winter. Moving is always an archaeological dig through your own history. On the second day of unpacking, I was organizing the front hall closet when Levi walked in carrying a heavy, dust-covered cardboard box. He grunted slightly, resting it on the floor. I recognized it immediately. It was the banker's box, the one I had started years ago, the one with "When I Have Time" written in faded black marker across the side. Levi wiped his dusty hands on his jeans and looked at the thick stack of papers inside. He saw the old, jaggedly torn envelopes and the dense legal contracts. He looked up at me, his expression neutral. "Does this belong to my father?" he asked. I looked at the box. It held the forged personal guarantee, the separation papers, the terrifying debt collection notices, and every piece of evidence detailing the exact methodology of Nolan's betrayal. It held the foundation of the man's entirely fraudulent life. "No," I answered, my voice steady and completely devoid of malice. "It belongs to what he left behind." Levi accepted the answer without pressing further. He pushed the box into the corner of the closet and went back to unpacking his books. I stood alone in the hallway for a long time, staring at the cardboard lid. A profound realization washed over me, settling deep into my bones. The desperate, terrified woman who had cried on the bathroom floor was gone. The frantic mother counting pennies at the slanted table no longer existed. Survival had quietly, steadily changed shape over the last decade. I was no longer merely enduring the life that had been forced upon me. Armed with patience, pristine data, and a fundamental understanding of how deceit operated, I was becoming incredibly dangerous to dishonest men. I am 46 years old now, and I no longer raise my voice. I do not have to. At Blackthorn Compliance Partners, where I sit as a senior investigations manager, the corporate executives who sit across from my polished mahogany desk have learned to fear my quiet composure far more than they would ever fear a shouting match. When a multinational logistics firm or a sprawling healthcare conglomerate loses track of a few $1,000,000, their representatives sit in my office and try to talk their way out of the math. I let them talk. I sip my black tea and wait for the precise moment their fabricated narratives collapse under the weight of verifiable truth. It is a quiet, immaculate power, born entirely from the ashes of the life someone else tried to burn to the ground. The financial terror that once defined my waking hours has been entirely neutralized. I own a modest, single-story brick house on a quiet, tree-lined street in a mature Charlotte neighborhood. It is not a sprawling mansion, nor is it designed to impress casual observers. It features a deep front porch with 2 sturdy rocking chairs and a garden I actually have the time to tend on Sunday mornings. More importantly, the deed to that house rests securely in a fireproof safe, entirely unencumbered by a mortgage. It was fully paid for by 19 years of relentless discipline, thousands of calculated decisions, and decades of grueling work that nobody ever applauded. I bought my piece brick by brick. Levi is 19 years old, and he is a revelation. He did not merely survive his childhood, he weaponized the analytical environment he grew up in. He is currently a junior at the university, carrying a double major in data analytics and finance. He is also interning at Blackthorn. He earned the position entirely on his own merit, passing the firm's notoriously brutal assessment tests with scores that made the managing partners raise their eyebrows. He is a brilliant, sharp-eyed young man who walks the halls with a quiet confidence. Even the senior partners have started requesting him for their preliminary risk assessments, because Levi has an uncanny, almost frightening reputation for seeing microscopic connections in sprawling datasets that seasoned veterans completely miss. Our bond is an easy, unshowy thing. We do not need grand declarations of affection because our connection is built from the solid repetition of shared survival. It exists in the dark roast coffee we brew in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, the dry, understated humor we trade across the dining table, and the complex courtroom podcasts we listen to during our shared commute to the financial district. We possess a profound understanding that never has to announce itself to the world. We are a closed, impenetrable unit. I genuinely believed Nolan belonged to an entirely different lifetime, a ghost successfully exorcised by time and distance. That illusion shattered on a perfectly ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing a highly sensitive forensic audit file when my desk phone softly chimed. It was the front desk receptionist. "Ms. Hodges," the receptionist said, her voice carrying a trace of mild confusion. "There is a gentleman in the lobby asking for you. He specifically asked for Cadence Hodges. He says it is a personal matter." I frowned, keeping my eyes on the spreadsheet in front of me. "Did he give a name?" "He said to tell you Nolan is here." The name hit my chest like a physical weight, but my hands did not shake. The terrified girl in the townhouse kitchen was long dead. I instructed the receptionist to send him back to my office. I closed the audit file, aligned my pen parallel to my keyboard, and waited. When Nolan Voss walked through my heavy glass door, he looked exactly like a man who had spent the last 2 decades purchasing his own reality. He was older, certainly, but the aging had been managed by expensive dermatologists and personal trainers. He was richer and significantly smoother, wearing a navy suit that easily cost more than my first car. He carried the practiced, effortless ease of a man who had learned exactly how to sell sincerity without ever quite feeling it. I knew exactly who he had become, of course. In my line of work, you keep an eye on the major players in the financial sector. He was now the polished face of Voss Stratton Holdings, a formidable financial group with prominent seats on various charity boards, glowing magazine profiles, and a carefully curated public image built entirely on civic legacy and corporate mentorship. "Cadence," Nolan said, pausing just inside the doorway as if waiting for an invitation to exist in my space. He offered a warm, perfectly calibrated smile. "You look incredible, truly. Time has been exceedingly kind to you." "Hello, Nolan," I replied, my voice remaining as flat and neutral as a sheet of glass. I did not stand up. I did not offer him a seat. "To what do I owe the unexpected interruption?" He stepped further into the room, seemingly unbothered by the freezing temperature of my reception. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and took the chair across from my desk, invading the space where sweating executives usually tried to lie to me. "I know I am the last person you ever expected to see," he began, his tone dropping into a rich, confessional register. "And I know I have no right to just walk in here, but I have been doing a great deal of reflecting lately. About legacy, about the past. I have been thinking about family." I let the word hang in the air between us. It sounded obscene coming from his mouth. "I want to meet my son," Nolan said, leaning forward slightly, resting his manicured hands on his knees. "I know he's 19 now. I know I missed the childhood years, and I will carry that regret for the rest of my life. But I am in a different place now. I want to make things right. I want to know him." I studied him. I applied the exact same analytical gaze I used to dismantle fraudulent ledger entries. To the untrained eye, he looked like a wealthy, remorseful father seeking late redemption, but I saw the microscopic discord in his rhythm. I noticed the faint, rigid tension in his jaw. I saw the way his fingers tapped a subtle, frantic beat against the fabric of his trousers. There was a distinct strain under the expensive polish. It was the specific, desperate tension men wear when a clock is aggressively ticking against them and they are rapidly running out of options. "You want to know him," I repeated, letting the skepticism bleed into my tone. "I do," Nolan insisted, offering a self-deprecating chuckle that sounded entirely rehearsed. "I have followed his progress from a distance. Of course, I hear he is quite the prodigy over at the university. He is interning here with you, is he not?" My spine stiffened imperceptibly. He had been looking into Levi. "He is doing well," I said simply, offering absolutely nothing he could use. Nolan smiled again. Leaning back in the chair, he crossed his legs, attempting to project casual interest. I always wondered how he would turn out. Given the industry you are in, and the one I dominate, I suppose it is in his blood. Tell me, Cadence, does he have his head for numbers? The air in my office seemed to stop circulating. The question was delivered with the casual, breezy tone of a father asking about a high school football game, but the underlying intent was radioactive. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The sudden appearance after 19 years of absolute silence, the subtle tracking of Levi's academic and professional progress, the specific inquiry about his analytical capabilities. Nolan Voss had not walked into my office because his conscience was bothering him. He had not come back because he missed a child, or because he wanted to heal old wounds, or because he suddenly discovered the true meaning of fatherhood. He was a man running a sprawling, complex financial empire. He was a man who built his early foundation by shifting massive liability onto a pregnant woman. He was a man who only ever engaged with the world transactionally. I looked at the silver threading in his hair and the cold calculation hiding behind his warm, marketable eyes. I understood everything at once. He did not need a son to love. He needed a useful man. And whatever crisis was currently unfolding inside Voss Stratton Holdings, it was significant enough to drive him back to the family he threw away, desperately hoping we were still naive enough to be used a second time. Levi is highly capable, I answered, my voice dropping to a near whisper that commanded the entire room. But you will find, Nolan, that he is nothing like you. Nolan merely smiled, assuming my response was just the lingering bitterness of a discarded wife. He had no idea what he was actually walking into. He thought he was opening a door to an easy mark. He did not realize he was stepping directly into a trap that had been waiting for him for 19 years. I waited until dinner was cleared away to tell him. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of evening traffic. I stood by the sink, drying a ceramic bowl with a cotton towel, and laid out the facts of the afternoon exactly as they had occurred in my office. I braced myself for a predictable teenage reaction. I expected a flash of defensive anger, a sudden demand for answers, or perhaps a painful, complicated curiosity about the man who had abandoned us. But Levi sat at the kitchen table, tracing the wood grain with his thumb, completely still. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask what his father looked like, or if the man had asked about our well-being. He looked up, his expression entirely composed, and asked one single, devastating question. What does he need from me? Levi agreed to a single, public meeting. He made it explicitly clear to me that he was not going out of some suppressed longing for a father figure or a desire for a heartwarming reunion. He simply wanted to look at the man with adult eyes, stripping away the childhood imagination that naturally fills in the blanks of an absent parent. He wanted to observe Nolan Voss as a variable in a real-world equation. In the 3 days leading up to the scheduled dinner, Levi treated his biological father like a hostile corporate profile awaiting a risk assessment. He spent hours running digital searches through proprietary financial databases, pulling public filings, and meticulously mapping out complex entity structures on his dual monitors. What he found painted a deeply troubling picture beneath the highly polished veneer of Voss Stratton Holdings. He uncovered 2 recent, quietly settled lawsuits from former business partners alleging severe breaches of fiduciary duty. He found significant, highly leveraged pension exposure deliberately hidden within tertiary subsidiary layers. Most concerning of all, he traced a labyrinth of shell entities that seemed explicitly designed to facilitate unusually timed charitable transfers right before the company released its quarterly earnings reports. The math was technically legal on paper, but the rhythm of the transactions was entirely discordant. While Levi analyzed the digital footprint, I went to the hall closet and pulled out the heavy cardboard banker box. I sat on the rug in my bedroom, turned on the reading lamp, and laid out the physical paperwork that anchored my past. I picked up the yellow carbon copy of the personal guarantee, the single document that had nearly destroyed my 20s with overwhelming debt. I placed it side by side with the pristine separation packet, I had stared at these pages 100 times over the years, but with my current investigative training, something entirely new materialized under the light. The date on the personal guarantee was typed clearly, but the embossed notarization stamp tucked into the bottom corner bore a glaring inconsistency. The stamp was dated 2 full weeks before I had ever signed the separation papers in my old, freezing kitchen. It was an impossible chronological sequence. The legal attachment carrying the massive financial liability had been officially notarized before it was ever physically presented to me for a signature. The next morning, I poured a cup of black coffee and called Tessa Bloom from my home office. My old mentor still possessed unparalleled contacts within the upper echelons of the financial sector. When I mentioned the name of Nolan's firm, her tone immediately shifted into a low, cautious register reserved for discussing active disasters. Voss Stratton is currently bleeding internally. Cadence, Tessa warned me privately, her voice tight with professional concern. The rumors circulating downtown suggest they are heading directly into a brutal trust control dispute. There are also whispers of an impending regulatory review regarding their proxy practices and board voting structures. If the board members sense blood in the water, or if the regulators find a single thread to pull, investor confidence will break completely. They will strip him of his authority before the quarter ends. The meeting between father and son took place on a Tuesday evening at a sleek, hyper-modern rooftop restaurant overlooking the city skyline. I did not attend. I sat on my front porch in the fading light, listening to the crickets, and waited. When Levi finally returned home just after 9 o'clock, he did not look shaken. He looked incredibly tired of playing a game he had already solved. He sat down in the wooden rocking chair opposite mine and methodically laid out the events of the evening. Nolan had arrived early, securing a premium corner booth that offered maximum privacy while still allowing him to command the attention of the room. He had not brought genuine apologies. Instead, he brought a heavy velvet-lined box containing a luxury fountain pen set. He also brought a printed, glossy folder outlining a highly prestigious summer internship offer at the Voss Civic Foundation. He slid them across the white tablecloth before the appetizers even arrived, as though an injection of corporate prestige could somehow retroactively make up for 19 entirely missing birthdays and a lifetime of silence. Levi recounted how Nolan had spent the first 45 minutes expertly reframing his profound cowardice as a youthful mistake. The man had blamed bad timing, immense professional pressure, and terrible advice from former mentors who allegedly pushed him to prioritize his career over his family. He spun a highly manicured narrative of a young man who was simply overwhelmed by the ruthless demands of the financial world. He talked around his deliberate abandonment with practiced corporate grace, utilizing passive language and vague regrets. He never quite managed to construct a full, honest sentence that contained a genuine apology or carried any actual moral weight. Levi had listened patiently, letting the man exhaust his prepared material and sip his expensive bourbon. Then, my son executed a masterclass in quiet, devastating interrogation. He did not ask about the firm, the foundation, or the reasons behind the sudden appearance. He asked simple, absolute factual questions. He asked Nolan to name the exact date of his birth. He asked for the name of the hospital where he was born. He asked for the name of the street where we had lived during that first difficult year. Nolan faltered entirely. The polished executive armor cracked under the weight of basic trivia. He guessed a date in late October, completely missing the mark by a full month. He confidently named a massive regional medical center instead of the small community hospital where I had labored alone. He laughed nervously, trying to wave away his failure by claiming he was always terrible with trivial details and dates. But Levi understood instantly. The man had not merely forgotten the facts over the passage of time. He had missed enough of them to definitively expose that he had never even tried to know the absolute basics of his own child's existence. The dinner had ended with a polite, meaningless handshake. Levi had left the luxury pen set and the glossy internship folder sitting precisely where Nolan had placed them on the table, refusing to carry away the bribes. Levi looked at me across the quiet expanse of our front porch, The streetlights cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp, analytical features he had honed over a lifetime of watching carefully and trusting only what could be proven. "He did not come to meet me," Levi told me, his voice carrying the calm, absolute certainty of a completed audit. "He came to measure whether I can help him." Our dining room table transformed into a quiet, heavily fortified war room over the next 48 hours. We did not need to speak much. We simply fell into our natural rhythms, dividing the investigation along the lines of our respective expertise. I handled the physical archaeology, digging through the dense, yellowed paper records and relying on 2 decades of institutional memory. Levi took the digital frontier, navigating a labyrinth of electronic filings, entity maps, and hidden timestamp patterns across multiple glowing monitors. I sat under the warm circle of the pendant light, smoothing out the yellow carbon copy of the personal guarantee. My fingers traced the exact line where my younger self had signed away her security. There was no lingering pain left in the gesture, only the cold, clinical detachment of an auditor performing a financial autopsy. With my current understanding of corporate structuring, the fog of the past finally cleared. Nolan had not merely been careless with a credit line, he had deliberately weaponized my signature to shift immense early business liability away from his own profile. During the exact same month, he handed me those separation papers. He was aggressively pursuing his first major corporate acquisition. He needed a pristine personal risk assessment to secure his mezzanine financing. By burying the toxic debt under my name using that altered legal attachment, he gave himself the clean runway he needed to rise, while completely abandoning me to absorb the catastrophic financial impact if his gamble failed. He had used my clean credit as a disposable shield. "Look at this," Levi said softly from the other end of the table, turning his right monitor toward me. I walked over and studied the intricate spiderweb diagram he had built mapping out Voss Stratton Holdings. Levi pointed to a central node labeled as a family trust. He married his second wife for her pedigree and her initial capital. Levi explained, his voice flat and analytical. His late investor father-in-law established a massive generational trust. Right now, Nolan is frantically trying to consolidate total voting authority over that trust to push through a highly leveraged merger that will save his current cash flow problems. But the trust charter has a standard, ironclad biological clause. All living heirs must be legally accounted for, either as beneficiaries or through formal, notarized waivers, before the voting structure can be permanently altered. The entire grand illusion shattered, leaving only the cold mechanics of a desperate transaction. The sudden warmth, the expensive rooftop dinner, the sudden interest in his long-lost son, it was all a frantic compliance exercise. Nolan needed me out of the way, but he needed Levi on paper. His true plan was incredibly transparent now. He intended to flatter Levi into signing a private acknowledgement of paternity, wrapped tightly in a strict non-disclosure agreement and a permanent waiver of all future financial claims against the estate. Once the legal threat was neutralized, Nolan could publicly present a newly reconciled, highly successful son to the board of directors, stabilizing investor confidence and proving his civic morality right before the critical control vote. "It gets significantly worse," Levi added, his fingers flying across the keyboard to pull up 2 side-by-side documents. "Look at the formatting." On the left side of the screen was a high-resolution scan of the separation packet I had signed 19 years ago. On the right was a recent, publicly filed proxy statement from Voss Stratton Holdings regarding a contested pension restructuring. "Notice the pagination," Levi instructed, highlighting a section in bright yellow. "Look at the kerning of the font on the signature pages compared to the liability clauses. Look at the digital timestamp intervals on the electronic filings." I leaned closer, resting my hands on the back of his chair. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The microscopic inconsistencies were identical. The legal boilerplate language was different, but the structural fingerprint was exactly the same. Nolan was still using the exact same page substitution and timing tricks he had used on me in that freezing townhouse kitchen. When he was cornered, when the liability became too great, He simply swapped the pages after the signatures were collected. It was a structural habit he had never bothered to break, likely because it had worked so perfectly the first time. The next afternoon, I took a very quiet, completely off-the-books coffee meeting with Tessa Bloom. We sat in a crowded cafe near the financial district, speaking in low, measured tones to avoid being overheard by the lunch rush crowd. When I laid out the dual structure of the trust consolidation and the undeniable formatting fingerprint my son had discovered, Tessa nodded grimly. She reached into her tailored blazer and slid a plain white business card across the table. It contained a single name and a phone number. "That is a senior investigator at the North Basin Financial Integrity Office," Tessa murmured, taking a slow sip of her espresso. "They are a very quiet regulatory agency, and they are already aggressively sniffing around Nolan regarding his pension exposure and his questionable proxy practices. They are currently building a shadow file. They know something is rotten, but they do not have the singular thread to pull the whole sweater apart. You have the thread. Cadence. You have the established historical pattern of fraud." I took the card and placed it securely inside my wallet. I did not call the number immediately. That evening, standing in our kitchen while the coffee pot hissed, Levi and I made a solemn, unbreakable pact. We promised each other that we would not act out of lingering rage. Anger is sloppy, and sloppy people make procedural errors. If Nolan Voss was going to go down, it would not be because of a scorned ex-wife or a bitter, abandoned child. He would fall because the empirical facts were complete, undeniably clean, and mathematically impossible to spin. We would build an airtight cage of data and simply wait for him to walk inside. We would not strike until the trap was perfectly set. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment escalated under a cloying disguise of paternal warmth. My phone and Levi's phone constantly lit up with texts and voicemails from Nolan. Every single message pretended a deep, newfound intimacy while casually pressing for signatures and public appearances. He would text Levi asking about his university classes, then immediately pivot to asking if he had reviewed the foundation paperwork yet. He called me twice to casually suggest we all grab lunch to formalize a few legal housekeeping items so we could finally focus on being a real family. We deflected every single advance with polite, non-committal delays, forcing his internal clock to tick louder and louder. The final move of his desperate game arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The mail carrier dropped a thick, heavy envelope onto the porch. It was made of premium stock paper, thick enough to require extra postage. I brought it inside and opened it at the dining table with Levi watching carefully from the doorway. Inside was a gilt-edged, beautifully embossed invitation. It requested our immediate, honored presence at the Voss Civic Foundation Annual Legacy Gala. The event was scheduled for the following weekend at Ravenscourt Hall, the most exclusive and highly photographed venue in the entire city. Levi read the elegant script over my shoulder and looked down at me, his dark eyes sharp and completely devoid of fear. Nolan was entirely out of time. The private dinners had failed. The casual text messages had failed. Now he was escalating the pressure to a massive, highly public stage. We both realized simultaneously that Nolan planned to use a glittering ballroom full of powerful witnesses, journalists, and corporate board members as his ultimate leverage. He intended to corner us in public, assuming a polite society setting would force our compliance. He truly thought the sheer weight of his wealthy world would crush us into silently signing our names. He had absolutely no idea what kind of people we had become. The phone call came exactly 48 hours after the embossed envelope landed on our porch. Nolan insisted on speaking to me directly, his voice dripping with an artificial vulnerability that made my stomach turn. He framed the upcoming Voss Civic Foundation Annual Legacy Gala not as a highly calculated corporate event, but as a desperately needed fresh start for our fractured family. He casually mentioned that the guest list was quite intimate, just a few hundred of his closest colleagues, trusted board members, and a handful of friendly journalists from the financial sector. I held the phone to my ear, looking out the kitchen window, completely disgusted by the sheer transparency of his maneuver. This was not reconciliation. It was strategy, dressing up his desperate corporate survival strategy in the warm, marketable garments of fatherhood. I fully expected Levi to decline the invitation. I was entirely prepared to call Nolan back and firmly shut the door on the entire theatrical production. But when I relayed the conversation to my son, Levi did not hesitate. He was standing by the refrigerator, pouring a glass of cold water. He took a slow sip, set the glass down, and looked at me with an icy, calculating calm. "Tell him we will be there," Levi said. "If he wants the truth in public, then public may be exactly where it belongs." On the evening of the gala, I dressed with deliberate, uncompromising restraint. I had no desire to compete with the glittering wives of the financial elite, nor did I want to look like a tragic figure seeking pity. I chose a tailored, midnight blue crepe dress with a high neckline and a sharp, structured silhouette. It was an outfit designed for absolute calm authority rather than theatrical drama. I pulled my hair back severely. My only accessory was a narrow, structured black leather clutch. It was just large enough to hold my lipstick, my phone, and 3 slim, neatly folded sheets of paper. Inside rested a high-resolution copy of the Altered Personal Guarantee, the proxy formatting proof Levi had discovered, and my own updated timeline notes. The clutch felt as heavy as an anvil in my hands. Ravenscourt Hall was a monument to old, entrenched money. When we handed the keys of my sensible sedan to the valet, we stepped into a world that operated on an entirely different gravitational pull. The venue gleamed with cascading crystal chandeliers that threw fractured light across pristine Italian marble floors. Massive glass bars anchored each corner of the room, serving top-shelf liquor to men in custom tuxedos. A massive donor wall, etched with the names of the city's most ruthless billionaires, dominated the foyer. A live jazz quartet played softly in the background, providing a smooth, sophisticated soundtrack to the evening. It was the exact kind of room where polished lies usually survive and thrive, simply because nobody wearing $10,000 worth of jewelry ever wants to acknowledge ugliness right before the dessert course is served. Nolan spotted us the moment we cleared the coat check. He broke away from a group of investors and moved through the crowded room like a man who genuinely believed the entire world still belonged to him. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and a smile so bright it looked physically painful. He did not drag us to a microphone for a formal announcement immediately. He was far too skilled a tactician for that. Instead, he employed a slow burn strategy, moving Levi through the crowd by the elbow and introducing him indirectly. He would stop by a cluster of wealthy trustees, place a proprietary hand on Levi's back, and seed the narrative in calculated whispers. I watched him from a distance, nursing a glass of sparkling water. Nolan was carefully laying the groundwork, allowing the rumors of a reunited, powerful family dynasty to ripple through the ballroom long before he ever took the stage. The social pressure was immense and entirely suffocating. At one point, an older woman dripping in flawless diamonds approached me near the carved ice sculpture. I recognized her from my preliminary research as a senior voting member of the Voss Stratton Board of Directors. She reached out and patted my arm with a terrifying, practiced warmth. "I just had to come over and say hello," the woman cooed, her eyes darting toward where Nolan was parading my son. "We are all just so thrilled that Levi will be joining the firm's leadership pipeline. You must be incredibly proud. Cadence, after all these years apart, to see how beautifully it all turned out." I stared at her perfectly lifted face. The absolute cruelty of her assumption nearly made me laugh out loud. She truly believed that a lifetime of abandonment could be neatly erased by a junior executive title and a customized corner office. I did not correct her. I simply offered a tight, polite smile and let the silence stretch until she grew uncomfortable and drifted back toward the bar. Levi eventually navigated his way out of Nolan's orbit and returned to my side. His jaw was set, and his dark eyes were rapidly scanning the perimeter of the sprawling ballroom. "Have you looked at the tables near the front?" Levi asked, his voice barely audible over the jazz music and the clinking of crystal glasses. "I have been entirely focused on avoiding the board members," I replied, keeping my posture relaxed. Look at the centerpieces on the first three tables, Levi instructed quietly. And look at the lanyards on the photographers hovering near the podium. I let my gaze drift casually toward the front of the room. Tucked discreetly beneath the massive floral arrangements on the primary VIP tables were thick, heavily bound proxy folders, the kind of folders distributed right before a major, legally binding corporate vote. Then I looked at the photographers. They were not society page columnists. Their press badges bore the logos of the top 3 national financial journals. "The gala is not just a charity dinner," Levi murmured, confirming exactly what we had suspected. "It is a strategically timed staging ground. The trust certification vote is happening tonight, right here, immediately after the speeches. He needs the public narrative of a stable, unified family secured on the record before those folders are opened." Before I could respond, the crowd parted slightly, and Nolan reappeared. He was flanked by 2 of his most prominent, deep-pocketed donors. He looked flushed with victory, completely oblivious to the trap he was enthusiastically building around himself. He stepped into our space, projecting the image of a deeply devoted patriarch. Nolan reached out and firmly grasped Levi's shoulder in front of the watching donors. He squeezed slightly, offering a devastatingly handsome, entirely hollow smile. "Thank you both for being here," Nolan said, his voice carrying the perfect resonant pitch of a man addressing an audience. "Tonight, we make things right." He looked at my son with absolute ownership. I stood perfectly still, my fingers tightening around the narrow black clutch in my hands. I looked at the man who had left me bleeding in a hospital 19 years ago, and I understood his language perfectly. When Nolan Voss said he was going to make things right, I sensed with absolute certainty that he meant he was going to make things profitable. He had no concept of morality. He only understood leverage, and he was about to discover that he had absolutely none left. The jazz quartet shifted into a faster, more vibrant tempo, signaling that the luxurious dinner service was finally drawing to a close. I stepped away from the main floor, seeking a brief moment of quiet in a softly lit side corridor that led toward the coat check and the private lounges. The heavy velvet drapes muffled the sound of the clinking crystal glasses and the low roar of wealthy conversations. I did not get to enjoy the silence for long. Footsteps echoed against the polished marble floor, sharp and incredibly deliberate. Nolan appeared around the corner. He had slipped away from his admirers, and for the first time all evening, the suffocating, marketable charm was completely gone. He looked intensely focused, his jaw clenched, treating the narrow hallway exactly like a hostile boardroom where a brutal corporate takeover was about to be finalized. "Cadence," he said, stepping close enough that I could clearly smell the expensive scotch on his breath and see the fine lines of tension around his eyes. "We need to finalize our understanding right now, before I go up to that podium and speak to the board." "There is absolutely nothing left to understand," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level, my hands resting calmly at my sides. He ignored my tone entirely, leaning in closer to offer what he clearly believed was an act of profound, life-altering mercy. "I am prepared to be incredibly generous. I have already drafted the legal paperwork to release full retroactive financial support to you. We are talking about a sum that will comfortably secure your retirement without you ever having to look at another spreadsheet. Furthermore, I will personally guarantee Levi immediate access to my entire corporate network. I will give him direct introductions to every major banking executive on the Eastern Seaboard. I even have a luxury condominium in the financial district ready to be transferred into his name by tomorrow morning. All he has to do is step into the private family suite with me and sign the legal acknowledgement before the speeches begin." I looked at his face. He genuinely expected gratitude. He expected the desperate, exhausted woman he had callously left in a freezing kitchen to eagerly grasp at the golden scraps he was finally dropping from his table. "That is not generosity, Nolan," I told him, my words cutting cleanly through the heavy air between us. "That is a purchase order placed exactly 19 years late. And my family is not for sale." For a fraction of a second, the polished executive mask slipped entirely, His eyes narrowed, and a flash of genuine, unadulterated panic crossed his features. The confident patriarch vanished, replaced instantly by a terrified man realizing his massive wealth could not buy his way out of a burning building. Before he could formulate another desperate counteroffer, I turned my back on him and walked purposefully back toward the bright lights of the ballroom. When I returned to the edge of the crowd, Levi was standing near a towering pillar of white orchids. He leaned closer to me as I approached, his dark eyes fixed intently on two elderly men in tailored suits standing just a few feet away near the dessert station. "Those are the senior trustees of the family trust," Levi whispered, his tone urgent but strictly controlled. "I just overheard them arguing about the specific emergency proxy language. Nolan does not just want a public relations win tonight. If the family acknowledgement is not signed and officially filed before the board votes in 30 minutes, a mandatory regulatory delay kicks in. A delay would instantly expose his highly leveraged positions and completely tank the trust certification vote. He desperately needs my signature right now just to survive the night." Our quiet, strategic conversation was abruptly interrupted. A woman holding a small digital audio recorder and wearing a press badge from the Charlotte Ledger Review stepped around the floral arrangement. She did not look at Nolan across the room. She looked directly at my son. "Excuse me," she said, her eyes darting between us with sharp professional curiosity. "You are Levi Hodges, correct?" The data analyst who assisted the state auditor on the municipal pension recovery project last year. Levi offered a curt, polite nod. I thought I recognized you from the committee hearings," the reporter continued, her journalistic instincts clearly inflamed by the strange social geometry of the room. "Can you tell me why a fiercely independent data prodigy is suddenly standing in the VIP section of Voss Stratton's Legacy Gala? Nolan Voss has never publicly mentioned having a son. Why is he suddenly so deeply invested in presenting you to his top shareholders tonight? You would have to ask Mr. Voss about his specific investment strategies," Levi answered smoothly, giving her absolutely nothing concrete, but expertly feeding her suspicion exactly the right kind of fuel. "I am only here tonight to ensure the public record remains completely accurate." The reporter's eyes widened slightly, immediately recognizing the loaded subtext of his carefully chosen statement. She quickly typed a long note into her mobile phone and melted back into the crowd, positioning herself exactly where a hungry investigative journalist needed to be. I scanned the back of the sprawling room and felt a deep, anchoring sense of relief wash over me. The heavy oak entrance doors swung open, and Tessa Bloom walked in. She was not alone. Flanking her were two individuals who distinctly did not fit the festive, glamorous aesthetic of the gala. One was a sharp-eyed woman carrying a slim leather briefcase, identifying her as our retained outside legal counsel. The other was a tall, unassuming man in a plain gray suit. He was the quiet contact from the North Basin Financial Integrity Office. They did not announce themselves or attempt to create a spectacle. They moved silently to a high-top table near the rear exit, taking strategic, observant positions. Tessa caught my eye across the sea of expensive tuxedos and gave a single, firm nod. They were not there to dramatically intervene. They were there because the exact timing of Nolan's desperate moves tonight was about to become highly evidentiary in a federal regulatory review. The pressure in the room was rapidly reaching a boiling point. A man wearing an earpiece and carrying a thick clipboard, clearly Nolan's chief of staff, pushed his way aggressively through the crowd toward us. He forced a wide, welcoming smile that completely failed to reach his anxious eyes. "Mr. Hodges," the chief of staff said, gesturing urgently toward a set of closed double doors near the main stage. "Your father is preparing for his keynote address. If you could please accompany me to the private family room. We have a few routine documents that require your immediate signature before we can proceed with the formal introductions." Levi did not move a single inch. He looked down at the anxious man with absolute, unbreakable authority. "No, thank you," Levi replied, his voice calm and carrying perfectly over the background jazz music. "I will stay exactly where I am. Anything honest my father has to say to me can be said out here, where the cameras already are." The chief of staff blanched, his mouth opening and closing silently like a trapped fish. He looked frantically toward the front of the room, realizing the carefully orchestrated corporate script had just been violently derailed. He spun on his heel and rushed away to deliver the catastrophic news to his boss. Standing securely beside my son, I experienced a quiet moment that felt entirely surreal. I remembered the heavy, suffocating fear that had paralyzed me when I was 27 years old, staring blindly at separation papers I did not fully understand. The frightened single mother Nolan had once casually abandoned would have been incredibly easy to manipulate in this opulent ballroom. She would have been intimidated by the immense wealth, terrified of the powerful men, and likely bullied into submission by the sheer theatrical weight of the gala. But the woman standing here tonight, holding a clutch filled with forensic proof, was absolutely not that girl. I felt a profound, electric stillness settle deep within my bones. I was no longer the prey. The chandeliers in the ballroom began to dim, and the jazz quartet brought their final, lively song to a close. A low murmur of anticipation rippled through the hundreds of assembled guests. Levi leaned his head down, speaking directly into my ear so softly that nobody else could possibly hear him. "Before we handed the keys to the valet, I ran a final security protocol," he whispered. "I uploaded all the supporting files, the proxy formatting comparisons, and the original personal guarantee timestamp data to 3 separate, heavily locked cloud locations. The release schedule is already locked in to release the files directly to the State Attorney General and the major financial publications at exactly midnight. Even if Nolan tries to pull the fire alarm, cut the building power, or use his security team to physically confiscate our phones, the evidence cannot be buried tonight. The trap is already closed." I reached out and briefly squeezed his arm, fiercely proud of the brilliant, uncompromising man he had become. A bright spotlight snapped on, illuminating the center of the stage. The massive crowd fell completely silent. Nolan Voss stepped up to the microphone. He adjusted his posture, beaming out at the sea of wealthy investors and powerful regulators. His smile was far too broad, stretched tight across his face like a physical barrier against his internal panic. He placed his left hand firmly on the polished wood of the podium, anchoring himself. He raised his right hand in a wide, welcoming gesture, gripping the edges of the story he desperately thought he was about to control. The amplified sound of a hand tapping against a microphone echoed sharply across the sprawling ballroom, immediately cutting through the low murmur of wealthy conversations. The jazz quartet faded their instruments into absolute silence. The heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed, and a single brilliant spotlight snapped onto the center of the main stage. Nolan Voss stood directly behind the polished mahogany podium, bathed in the blinding white light. He looked magnificent. He wore the expression of a man who had successfully conquered his own history, radiating a practiced, humble warmth that had undoubtedly cost him a fortune in public relations consulting to perfect. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward just enough to project an aura of intimate confession to a room containing hundreds of the most powerful people in the city. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nolan began, his voice a rich, perfectly modulated baritone that commanded absolute attention. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the milestones of the Voss Civic Foundation. We are here to talk about capital, about growth, and about the future of our shared investments. But as I look out over this incredible room, I find myself thinking about something far more valuable than quarterly returns. I find myself thinking about the profound weight of legacy. I am thinking about second chances, and the ultimate responsibility we all share to build something that lasts far beyond the lifespan of one single man." He paused, allowing the weighty, carefully scripted words to settle over the audience. He was expertly casting himself in the role of the redeemed patriarch, the wise executive who had finally realized that money was meaningless without family. It was a beautiful, entirely fabricated narrative. "For many years, I dedicated every waking hour to building this financial institution," Nolan continued, placing a hand over his heart. "In that relentless pursuit, certain bonds were stretched. Certain priorities were misplaced in the fires of ambition, but life, in its infinite grace, occasionally offers us the opportunity to correct our course. It offers us the chance to welcome our blood back into the fold. Tonight, I am incredibly honored to introduce a young man who represents the absolute future of this family's values. He is brilliant, he is driven, and he is living proof that some bonds always find their way home. Nolan turned his body toward the side of the stage and extended his right arm in a grand theatrical gesture. Please welcome my son, Levi Hodges. The applause that followed was incredibly thin and terribly uncertain. It did not swell with genuine emotion. It was the polite, conditioned clapping of corporate elites who had been thoroughly trained to applaud whenever a powerful man signaled that an applause line had been delivered, regardless of whether they actually understood the context. Board members exchanged confused, rapid glances. The reporter from the Financial Journal stepped out from behind a floral arrangement, her digital recorder thrust forward. Levi stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the center of the stage. He did not rush. His strides were perfectly measured, entirely devoid of the nervous energy that usually accompanies a sudden public introduction. He was not scowling, nor was he offering the camera-ready smile Nolan so desperately needed. His face was a mask of pure, composed observation. Watching him move, I could see the exact moment Nolan let out a microscopic breath of relief. The executive genuinely believed his heavy-handed social trap had worked. He thought the sheer intimidation of the ballroom had forced my son into compliance. I stayed exactly where I was, standing in the shadows near the rear exit doors, gripping my narrow black clutch so tightly my knuckles ached. Every maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to march up those velvet stairs, stand between my son and the man who had abandoned him, and drag Levi out of that toxic room. But I forced my feet to remain planted on the marble floor. I understood the cruel geometry of social warfare. If I stepped in too early, if I raised my voice or caused a scene, Nolan would instantly pivot. He would cast a sympathetic look at the crowd and frame my intervention as the hysterical bitterness of a jealous, unstable ex-wife. He would use my anger to validate his own narrative. I had to let Levi take the lead. I had to let my son dismantle the machine from the inside. Levi reached the podium. Nolan placed a heavy, affectionate hand on Levi's shoulder, smiling brightly for the flashing cameras, and then stepped back to surrender the microphone. Levi adjusted the height of the microphone stand. He looked out over the sea of upturned faces, letting the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was crystal clear, completely devoid of tremor, and utterly devastating. I want to begin by thanking Cadence Hodges, Levi said. The name rang out like a gunshot in a cathedral. The entire emotional center of the room violently shifted in a fraction of a second. Nolan's smile froze, turning brittle and unnatural. She is the woman who raised me entirely alone, Levi continued, his tone carrying the precise, unyielding weight of an absolute truth. She worked double shifts to ensure we had a roof over our heads. She studied by the light of a kitchen stove so she could build a career out of absolute nothing. She is my mother, and she is the only reason I'm standing here tonight. A heavy, suffocated silence fell over the VIP tables. The wealthy donors stopped breathing. Levi had taken Nolan's carefully constructed script of paternal redemption and completely incinerated it in 2 elegant sentences. We hear a lot of talk about legacy and bloodlines in rooms like this, Levi said, his eyes locking directly onto the senior trustees seated in the front row. But biology is merely a physical blueprint. It can explain a resemblance in a jawline or the color of an eye. It does absolutely nothing to explain character. Biology does not explain sacrifice. It does not dictate who chooses to stay when the pressure becomes unbearable, and it certainly does not determine who stood in the doorway to protect you when life was incredibly hard. Nolan realized he was rapidly losing control of the stage. The public relations victory was transforming into a catastrophic public relations nightmare. He stepped forward quickly, invading Levi's space, attempting to forcibly recover the momentum. He let out a loud, entirely artificial laugh that scraped painfully against the acoustics of the room. "Always the analytical mind," Nolan projected into the microphone, trying to playfully clap Levi on the back. "He gets his intense focus from my side of the family, clearly. But before we get too deep into the philosophical weeds, we do have a small bit of foundational business to attend to. A minor formality to make this beautiful reunion official." Nolan snapped his fingers toward the wing of the stage. His chief of staff practically sprinted forward, carrying a thick leather folder and the luxury fountain pen set from the rooftop dinner. Nolan took the folder and flipped it open on the podium, pushing it toward Levi. He was desperately trying to keep the moment upbeat and purely transactional. He assumed that if he put a pen in Levi's hand in front of 300 witnesses, the social pressure would finally break him. Levi looked down at the documents. He did not explode. He did not shout about abandonment or hurl the expensive pen into the crowd. He simply looked up at the man standing next to him, his expression reflecting the cold, terrifying precision of a seasoned forensic auditor. "Making paperwork official," Levi repeated smoothly, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "Just to be perfectly clear, Mr. Voss, are these documents structurally similar to the standard financial cleanup you presented to my mother exactly 19 years ago?" The color instantly drained from Nolan's face. His hand hovered rigidly over the open folder. "I do not think this is the appropriate venue for historical accounting," Nolan hissed, his voice dropping an octave, trying to mask his panic from the microphones. "I disagree," Levi replied, speaking directly into the sound system. "Since you have invited the press and the Trust Certification Committee to witness my integration into this family, the public record must be absolutely flawless. I just have one highly specific question before I sign a permanent waiver. Regarding the massive personal guarantee you used to secure your initial corporate acquisitions, the liability you claimed was properly executed during your marital separation. On what exact date was that specific financial liability legally finalized and notarized?" Nolan was cornered, standing in front of his entire empire, with regulators and journalists hanging on his every word. He made the fatal calculation of a man who believed his own lies. He assumed Levi was bluffing, probing in the dark without any actual proof. He needed to project absolute confidence to the board members sitting 15 feet away. He needed to prove the liability was handled correctly during the separation timeline. "It was finalized on the 14th of November, Nolan answered quickly, his voice loud and defensively firm, completely unaware that he was stepping into a bear trap. "The exact same day the separation agreements were signed. It was a simultaneous, fully documented transaction. He said it in front of the board. He said it in front of the trustees. He said it directly into the digital recorder of the financial journalist standing at the edge of the stage. From my position in the back of the room, I opened the clasp of my black clutch. Nolan Voss had just publicly committed to a timeline that was a mathematical impossibility, and he had just provided the exact verbal testimony we needed to completely destroy him. "The 14th of November, Levi repeated into the microphone. His voice was calm, carrying the devastating weight of absolute certainty. "That is a fascinating timeline, Mr. Voss. It is fascinating because the notary stamp on the financial liability attachment you filed with your early investors is clearly dated the 1st of November. That is exactly 14 days before the separation agreement was ever placed in front of my mother." Nolan froze. The artificial smile finally broke, sliding off his face like wet clay. Levi reached out and placed his hand on the thick leather folder Nolan had just pushed toward him. Levi flipped it open so the front row could see the pages. "And this document, the highly generous paperwork you want me to sign tonight to permanently release my claim to the family trust, contains the exact same formatting discrepancy. The signature page is completely detached from the restrictive liability clauses. You are asking me to sign a blank page tonight so you can substitute the terms tomorrow morning. You are running the exact same play you ran 19 years ago." A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. Levi turned his gaze away from Nolan and looked directly out into the crowd of wealthy donors and powerful regulators. "I did not come to this gala tonight to reclaim a father. I came here to confirm a pattern. A pattern of structural fraud that stretches from a forged personal guarantee on a slanted kitchen table to manipulated trust documents in a billionaire's ballroom. Right on cue, Tessa Bloom stepped out from the shadows near the rear exit. She walked down the center aisle of Ravenscourt Hall with measured, confident strides. Flanking her were the two individuals who had been waiting quietly by the doors. The outside counsel carried a thick, heavily bound dossier. They stopped right at the edge of the stage. The quiet man in the gray suit, the observer from the North Basin Financial Integrity Office, formally received the evidence packet from Tessa. He opened the first page, his eyes scanning the data, and he gave a curt, professional nod. Nolan gripped the podium, his knuckles turning completely white. "Security," he demanded, his voice cracking violently. "Remove these people from my event immediately." Nobody moved. The security guards standing along the walls looked toward the board members, waiting for a signal that was never going to come. I stepped forward. I left the shadows and walked into the ambient light of the chandeliers. The crowd parted for me instinctively. I reached the base of the stage, standing directly below the man who had once tried to erase my future. I opened the clasp of my narrow black clutch. I reached inside and pulled out the thin yellow piece of paper. I held it up. "This is the original carbon copy of the separation packet," I declared. My voice did not shake. I did not need a microphone because the massive ballroom had descended into a terrified, suffocating silence. "It contains my handwritten margin notes and the original date marks from 19 years ago. It proves definitively that the financial attachment you used to secure your first major corporate acquisition was altered and attached long after I signed the primary document. You built your entire empire by hiding your toxic business liability behind a woman who was 8 months pregnant." The reporter from the Charlotte Ledger-Review standing near the stairs immediately grasped the massive scale of the revelation. She spoke into her digital audio recorder, her voice breathless but incredibly loud in the silent room. "He did not merely abandon a pregnant wife. He built the foundation of his early climb by hiding his financial liability behind her, and he is attempting a cleaner version of the exact same trick tonight through the son he completely ignored." Chaos erupted, but it was a cold, corporate kind of chaos. The senior trustees in the front row stood up simultaneously. The chairman of the board of directors raised his hand, his face flushed with profound anger and embarrassment. "The trust certification process is halted," the chairman announced, his voice booming across the room. "I am publicly suspending the vote on the spot pending a full federal regulatory inquiry." Several major investors physically stepped away from the stage, backing into the crowd as if physical distance might somehow save them from the legal contamination radiating from the podium. Nolan Voss shattered. He cycled through every single failed strategy in a matter of seconds. First came the desperate grasp for authority. He slammed his hand against the wood. "I am the chief executive of this firm. You cannot do this." When the board ignored him, he pivoted to pure denial. "She forged that paper. It is a lie." Then came the wounded outrage, his face twisting into a mask of betrayal. "I am your father. I gave you life." When the entire room remained hostile, Nolan finally dropped his voice. He leaned across the podium toward Levi, his eyes wide and frantic, pleading privately. "Please, Levi, you are destroying everything I have ever built. We can fix this. I can give you anything you want." None of it landed. It was like watching a ghost try to punch a brick wall. Levi looked at the sweating, terrified man under the blinding spotlight. My son did not look angry. He simply looked finished. "I am not destroying anything," Levi said smoothly into the microphone, ensuring the entire room heard his final judgment. "The math is simply correcting itself. You came back for my name. You never earned it." Levi stepped back from the podium. I looked up at Nolan one last time. He looked down at me, and for the very first time in my life, I saw him stripped entirely of his armor. I delivered the final emotional blow without raising my voice a single decibel. "I did not spend 19 years raising Levi to destroy you. Nolan," I said, my words carrying the absolute weight of a life fully lived and completely owned. I did it only to make certain that no polished man could ever bury us again. The firm's legal counsel stepped forward and gestured to the head of security. 2 guards walked onto the stage. They did not move to protect Nolan Voss. They took him by the arms and escorted him away under a silence that was far more humiliating than any screaming match could ever be. He did not fight them. He walked out with his head bowed, stripped of his power, his legacy, and his illusion. His expensive leather folder remained sitting on the mahogany podium, completely untouched, like a bad joke that absolutely nobody wanted to claim. Levi walked down the velvet steps. He offered me his arm. I took it, resting my hand against his sleeve. We turned our backs on the stage and walked together down the long center aisle. The wealthy elites parted for us, their eyes lowered in deference. We pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool Charlotte night. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of wet pine and city asphalt. We walked toward the valet station in companionable silence. I felt a profound, overwhelming peace settle into my chest. We were not drunk on revenge. Revenge is a chaotic, empty pursuit. We were steadied by something infinitely better and far more permanent. We carried the quiet, beautiful knowledge that the real victory was never about humiliating Nolan. It was about building a life so incredibly solid, so heavily fortified by truth and discipline, that when he finally came back to use us, he found there was absolutely nothing left to take. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, do not forget to subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.